So, welcome everyone. Good morning and welcome to our panel discussion, Racism, Intersectionality, and Social Justice. My name is Krista Danis and I am the Events and Program Coordinator at the Aurora Public Library. Thank you to our panelists and our moderator for being here and making this event possible. And thank you to the audience for tuning in on Zoom and Facebook Live. So before we begin, I do want to let you know about a couple of important initiatives. As you know, social justice conversations should be happening in all age groups, including children. Join Miss Sophie on Saturday, June 27th at 10 a.m. for Sunshine Storytime, a virtual, live, all ages social justice storytime that spreads kindness, acceptance, and inclusivity. We are taking registrations for that event, so if you're interested, please log into our website at aurorapubliclibrary.org and sign up. And finally, don't forget to take the census. It has been extended to October 31st, but you don't have to wait that long. If you've already taken it, great, good for you. Please remind your friends, your family, your neighbors, your colleagues to do the same. It's about representation and everyone counts. For more information on the 2020 census, please visit aurorapubliclibrary.org/ucount. So we'll be kicking off our event today with an introduction to our moderator and esteemed panel of experts and community leaders. After which I will hand it over to Sherman to get us started. Each panelist will have an opportunity to speak independently to the current state of racism and social justice, followed by moderator questions and closing with questions from the audience. For those questions that were submitted prior to the event, they will be addressed, of course. And if you have any questions during the presentation, you can submit them directly on Zoom via the Q&A function or in the Facebook Live comments for this event. And we will do our best to answer those questions today. So starting with introductions, welcome Dr. Adrienne Komen. She serves as the Director of Equity and Inclusion at the Illinois Math and Science Academy. Her areas of focus include public health, social justice, and diversity education, and higher gifted education, particularly STEM. She possesses a doctorate in educational leadership from Argosy University and a Master of Science in Health Education, as well as a Master of Science in Higher Education, both from Illinois State University. Welcome, Dr. Komen.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. And Dr. Vincent Gaddis is the Criminal Justice Chair at the DuPage County NAACP, has worked as a professor of history, philosophy, and theology at Benedictine University for 25 years. He's also a community activist focusing on race, racism, and the prison industrial complex. Dr. Gaddis possesses a Doctor of Philosophy and History from Northern Illinois University. And thank you for being here today, Dr. Gaddis.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yay. Panelist Kay Page has a career that spans both public and private sectors. She's honed her government relations experience working for the Illinois Governor's Office, as well as the Senate Office of President Barack Obama. Kay continues her commitment to public service as she serves on the boards of the Quad County Urban League, the West Suburban Food Pantry, Mutual Ground, Hope's Front Door, and is president of the Democratic Women of DuPage County. Kay earned an undergraduate. Yeah. Kay earned an undergraduate degree from Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, and a Doctor of Jurisprudence from Vanderbilt University School of Law in Nashville, Tennessee. And we are so happy to have you with us today, Kay.
Thank you so much.
And our moderator this morning, Sherman Jenkins, was appointed Alderman at Large for the City of Aurora in 2017. In 2019, he was elected to a 4-year term. Sherman has served as Executive Director and Assistant Director of the Aurora Economic Development Commission for the City of Aurora. He began service there in 1991 and until he retired in December of 2012. Sherman has a deep commitment to Aurora, as demonstrated by his involvement with the Aurora Rotary Noon Club, board member for the Northern Lights Development Corporation, chairman of the board of directors and founding member of the Quad County African American Chamber of Commerce, and member of the Interfaith Aurora organization. So thank you so much for moderating this discussion this morning, Sherman.
My pleasure. Thank you, Krista.
Sure. And without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
All righty. Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Krista. And good morning, everyone. Our topic today really smacks right in the face of issues that have plagued America for decades. Racism, intersectionality, and social justice. And I want to thank the Aurora Public Library for putting this on and assembling the panelists who bring knowledge and experience to these topics. And these topics are one that, you know, as we go through this, we're probably going to get a little emotional. We're probably going to get a little sentimental, but it's something that we have to address. It is so important, and we have to keep it on the front burner. It reminds me of what a friend, a Rotarian, told me. We were talking about COVID when it first started, and people were saying, wow, that COVID has happened to us. Why is this happening to us? And she's into philosophy and meditation. She said, Sherman, I don't think COVID is happening to us. It's happening for us. And when she said that, I thought about that, and I said, you know what? And then all of a sudden, all these things began to happen. And it came in the light that what she said is so true. It's happening for us. And so we have to deal with these issues. And nature and the creator is forcing us to do it, whether we want to do it or not. Okay, that's my philosophical aspect I put out there, and we'll leave that alone from the rest of the presentation. So the format today will we allow each panelist to address the issue, and once that is accomplished, we will go into Q&A segment, as Krista had mentioned. And I will lead it off in the Q&A segment, followed by questions from our viewers on Zoom and Facebook. And hello, all of you guys. So let's get started. Dr. Komen, I'm going to have you to kick it off. Always got to have ladies first, and in alphabetical order. So racism, intersectionality, and social justice. Your thoughts?
All right, so I would like to start off by sharing a brief PowerPoint that I put together to discuss just systemic racism as well as some of my experiences. I think we need to look at this from a global perspective. So I've had an opportunity to actually travel around the world and study the transatlantic slave trade. And so I want to talk about racism in America through that lens. I want to look at it from the beginning and bring it to present time, to today. So if you would allow me to share my screen, I will get started with my thoughts and perspectives about racism, intersectionality, and social justice. So please give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen without my notes. All right, perfect, thank you. So I wanna start off with the pyramid of hate. And some may think this is a very strong way to start off this segment, but the reality is this is where we are right now. We are in a situation in which hate just persists. And this hate has been going on for over 400 years. And it's time for us to deal directly with this hate, with systemic racism here in America. So where does it start? It starts at the root of having these biased attitudes and stereotyping different groups of people and thinking that certain people are inferior just because of race or the color of your skin. And then it's followed by this sort of acts of bias. So we're going to use non-inclusive language. We're going to be insensitive. We're going to be belittling to different groups just because of their race. From there, it leads to systemic discrimination. And I mean, that's what you're seeing right now with Black and brown people dying at a higher rate from COVID. That's what you see right now with the murders and lynchings and execution of Black people here in America. From there, it goes to this bias motivated violence, right? And we're definitely there with the lynchings. And at the top of this pyramid is genocide. And that's a pretty scary thing. We've seen that with our indigenous population. So this is America right now. And as much as people want to say America is this great place, we have a lot of hate, we have racism, we have issues that need to be resolved, and we have groups of people here in America who do not feel like they're being treated fairly, who do not feel as if they're included as part of the community, and who feel less than. So I've had a chance to travel around the world. This is Ghana. And what you see here is El Camino. Some people refer to it as a castle. It was a prison. It is where Africans were captured and taken before they would put on ships to go to different parts of the world to be enslaved. And if you see at the top, right there in the middle, that door is what they referred to as the door of no return. They knew, Africans knew, my ancestors knew, when they went out of that door, they weren't going to come back to their homeland. They knew when they left that door, they were going to these unknown foreign lands, and they had no idea for some what that outcome would be, but they knew they weren't coming back. And then if you see in the top corner with this little bit of light, that's actually from within one of the cells where prisoners were kept. And it would be about 150 to 200 slaves in this very small room, sitting there without food, without water, waiting for the next ship to arrive. This is how America started. And these issues, right? Even though we're no longer enslaved as Black people, the issues that exist or still exist today. And I'm going to talk about some of those issues throughout. I've gotten a chance to go to Belize, Brazil, Cuba. These were other countries where Africans who were enslaved were dropped off. And what I found in my studies is that no matter where we were as Africans, we were treated less than, we were marginalized, we were treated as if we were not human. I just wanted to share these experiences with you because the experiences of Black people in America are not just restricted to only Blacks in America. This is happening to enslaved people around, or people who have previously been enslaved around the world, right? And we need to think about what this means from a global perspective. Some might even say that the Blacks in America have it a bit better because we have a true middle class. But the reality is it's going to take us 250 years to create the same level of wealth that white America has. Just things for you to think about. So there's this theory that suggests, it's referred to as the slavery hypertension hypothesis, but it suggests that for Blacks who actually made it to their destinations, they were able to retain salt, right? Because you were going through all of the salt water. So they were able to retain salt. And this suggests that if you're able to retain salt, then that possibly has led to increased levels of hypertension and high blood pressure in Black America, which has led to some health disparities. As a matter of fact, hypertension affects 40% of Black men and Black women here in America. And they said, it's theory, it's a result of basically our trip here to America and being able to retain that salt. Now, it's only a theory. However, what's been proven is what we refer to as Sojourner syndrome. And according to solid research, historically, African-American women are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of race-related stress, given their socially constructed identities as African-Americans and as women. These findings are consistent with the hypothesis that racial discrimination is a chronic stressor that can negatively impact the cardiovascular health of African-Americans through pathogenic processes associated with serious negative reactive changes in blood pressure and heart rate. Basically, as a result of systemic racism, it has impacted the health of Black people here in America as well as around the globe. Also here in America, what we see is this sort of mistrust of the healthcare system. One, because of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, in which you had almost 400 Black men who were given syphilis and untreated so that the healthcare system could study it, right? And then you also saw the forced and coerced sterilization of Black women because American society said preventing the defective from reproducing would actually benefit humanity. So here in America, we have health disparities that exist as a result of systemic racism. Some believe it's also contributed to us coming here to America during the transatlantic slave trade. And so there's an issue. And so now, what does this mean about current times? We've had this horrific pandemic of coronavirus, COVID-19. And what we found is that we have a lot of Black people who have underlying health issues, which are a result of systemic racism, who are dying at higher rates from COVID. They're being diagnosed with COVID more than any other of our cultures within our population, right? And just to share personally, this is something that has affected my own home, as my father was diagnosed with COVID-19. He's at home recovering, but a lot of the underlying health issues, such as hypertension and diabetes, he has. So this is something that's very personal to me. So let's look at how racism has actually impacted COVID-19. If we look at some of the structural barriers, what we found is that there are a lot of segregated communities, and these communities don't necessarily have good, safe drinking water. They have substandard housing conditions. Then if we look at this from a testing perspective, you have Black people in certain communities who are being turned away from testing. And then that means they have to actually rely on going to the hospital to get tested, and many don't have insurance. In terms of treatment and survival, the hospitals in segregated neighborhoods, a lot of them are poorly resourced, and they just don't have access to the level of care that is needed. Then we have more Black people who are actually being exposed to COVID because they're essential workers. They have to go to work if they want to survive. And then we're also not surveilling it in the way that we should. We don't even have an accurate count, really, of how many Black people this is affected because we're not taking the time to find out so. So what do we need to do? We need to treat racism as a public health crisis and go beyond the extent that we have focused on COVID-19, as racism has a long history and is interwoven into every fabric of America. We need to rebuild the trust of Black and Latino communities in the public health system by acknowledging the history, providing access to excellent culturally responsive healthcare, and having an intentional focus on addressing racially based health disparities. And we need to develop a culturally responsive education protocol to educate diverse groups about COVID-19, providing them with resources they need to be tested. Now, I know I've talked a lot about COVID, that's my health background, but what I've also mentioned a lot about systemic racism. And I want you to understand that there are different types of racism, because you'll have a lot of people say, well, I'm nice, I have a Black friend, you know, I don't do these things. Well, we have individual racism, and that's an individual discriminating against another because of the color of their skin. But we also have systemic racism, which we find on the institutional level as well as the societal level. And these issues with COVID, as well as the murder and execution of Black people, is a result of systemic racism. In honor, I just need to mention George, Brianna, and Ahmed, and I'm sure my STEM panelists or my panelists colleagues, they'll talk more about these issues of police brutality and just the hate that exists. But I also want to share, we've been fighting this for over 400 years, and we still fight against systemic racism. And we need to ask ourselves, why? Why haven't these issues been resolved? Why is it that we have to still fight? Now, a lot of times people talk about, well, there's reverse racism. Reverse racism does not exist. Racism equals racial prejudice plus power. And collectively, Black people do not have power here in America, right? So therefore, we cannot be racist against others. So with that in mind, what if it did exist? Let's take a look at these pictures. What if the story was different? How would you feel? What would you do? Would you call out inequity and injustice? Would you fight by any means necessary for the end of racism? And with that, I'm going to end and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But what would you do?
That's fantastic, Dr. Komen. And that to leave with that question is one that I think all of us can think about. And so I want to move into Ms. Kay Page and get her thoughts with regards to our topic, but also thinking about what Dr. Komen said, what would you do? So Dr. Page, take it on.
Thank you, Alderman Jenkins, and thank you, Dr. Komen. It's actually a perfect intersection of what I'm going to discuss today. First, let me thank our hosts for having us today to discuss the challenges that are before us and that have been with our nation since before it was founded. I know many in our audience have seen the videos of people calling the police on Black people for doing mundane things, just living. They've been made into memes. Barbecue Becky, the woman who called the police on African Americans for having a barbecue in a public park. Permit Patty, a woman who called the police on an 8-year-old Black child for selling water. And most recently, the Central Park Ramble incident, in which the police were called on a Black man who simply asked a dog owner to follow the law and leash their dog. This video struck a chord in me like no other. The woman who called the police said in a calm voice, "I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life." Then once on the phone with 911, she, Amy Cooper, worked herself into hysteria and said, "I'm being threatened." In that moment, she knew the power of her words. She knew the power of race, and she weaponized it. 65 years after Emmett Till, a child killed for allegedly whistling at a white woman, race was once again used as a weapon that in too many instances cost people their lives. These, in my mind, are clear cases of racism and abuse. And that is what most people think about when they discuss racism and racist. We think Dylan Hood and Mother Emanuel Church. We think KKK. We think Charlottesville. We think of weaponizing one's race to prove dominance or superiority. May I raise the idea that each and every day there are microaggressions perpetrated against people of color based on race that are harmful and dangerous to any community or people seeking to progress. What's a microaggression? Psychology today defines it as a subtle, often unintentional form of prejudice. Rather than an overt declaration of racism or sexism, a microaggression often takes the shape of an offhand comment or an inadvertently painful joke or pointed insult. Researchers at Columbia say microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities. Here are a few examples. When you meet someone for the first time, do you say, "You're not what I pictured"? Do you clutch your purse when youth of color walk close to you? Do you say or think, "He's attractive for a Black man"? You demand to see a supervisor because there's no way that this employee of color could be the final word. Or when a person of color is stern, are they now angry and threatening to you? Or do you seek to diminish and dehumanize them with stereotypical mocking? I'm sure our students in the audience have heard, "You're the smartest Black kid in class." Or how about when you interact with the police and are pulled over? "Is that your car? Or why are you in this particular location?" Harvard psychiatrist Chester Pierce coined the phrase, "subtle blows delivered incessantly." Some will say, "Get over it, don't be so sensitive." But it needs to be understood that day after day, from your youth through your adulthood, from your schooling to your professional life, day after day, microabuses based off the color of your skin are demoralizing and dehumanizing, and it is killing us. And I do mean literally killing us, as Dr. Komen said. Dr. Schulman, president of the American Psychological Association, said, "Racism is associated with a host of psychological consequences, including depression, anxiety, and other serious, sometimes debilitating conditions. Moreover, the stress caused by racism can contribute to the development of cardiovascular disease and other physical diseases. 13.8% of African-American children have high blood pressure. African-Americans develop heart disease younger and die sooner. African-Americans have a shorter life expectancy." David Williams has this amazing TED Talk regarding the effects of microaggressions and racism on the health of people of color. He said higher levels of discrimination are associated with an elevated risk of a broad range of diseases, from high blood pressure to abdominal obesity, to breast cancer, to heart disease, and even premature mortality. It is killing people of color. Something has to change in order for all people, regardless of the color of their skin, to be able to live a full, just life, to just live. I teach an ethics class, and one of the questions I ask my students is, what's the most effective way to effectuate change? Is it to change the laws or to change people's hearts? I get a mixture of answers. Some will use historical events to say you have to change the law, like the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s. I would make the argument that the way to effectuate change in society is to change people's hearts. Microaggressions will not stop until we see each other's humanity. But how do we do that? Where do we start? Step one is awareness. Ask yourself, have I done this? Do I have implicit bias? Have I committed a microaggression? Once you know, once you acknowledge, things can begin to change. Be conscious of your behavior when you interact with somebody who doesn't look like you. Step two, have the conversation with people of color in your life. Ask them their experiences and their experiences with you. This conversation is to listen, not defend. And I would say to the person of color, be open and understand that the person asking is making themselves vulnerable. Kind of on a side note, yesterday was Juneteenth, and for some it was a new day. I would say part of listening is learning history, not Black history, because there is no Black history, it's American history. Step three, don't say it, and if you do say it, acknowledge it and make amends. Don't be afraid of the difficult conversation. Everyone will be uncomfortable in these conversations, but discomfort will lead to change. And step four, call it out when you see it. See something, say something. When you're in a room and the inappropriate joke is made, or a question is asked that is inappropriate, say something. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall said, "We must dissent from indifference. We must dissent from apathy. We must dissent from fear, the hatred, and the mistrust." I will close with this. Day after day, week after week, watching someone that looks like you or looks like someone you loved be dehumanized and killed is a weight that I haven't found the proper word to describe. The change cannot come from people of color alone. Everyone has a role to play. There is too much at stake for everyone not to get involved and do the work and allow people to just live.
Well, with everything that's going on, and as many of us have talked to friends and colleagues, and I've had some of, as people say, my Caucasian or white friends who have sent me notes and say, I feel so bad. And they're asked the question, what should I do? What can I do? And I always like to say, well, you have your friends who are Caucasian, and do you have the talk? Like the talk. Yeah, do you talk about what's going on and what you have seen, or what you or your friend have done to someone of color? And then you get this dumbfound look. And it's like, it's nothing wrong with you doing that. Some people hate the fact that there was an article in the New York Times recently that said, the writer said, the problem with racism is white people. And just that one sentence stopped a lot of folks. And I had a friend and I said, the problem with racism is you white people. And again, they stopped. And, to address it, yes, it's uncomfortable, but you have to address it so that you will never see what happened to a man having a knee in his neck for almost 10 minutes. That, no matter how you try to address it, it affected every human being. And as a human being, we have to look at it and address it and stop running from it. And the young people, thank God that we start as young people and we become old people. The young people have the energy to saying enough is enough. And it's not just Black, it's not Hispanic, it's white. It's all of the young folks, and all of us have to get in there and really work. And it takes all of us to make this change. And the man who has been working diligently for a number of years to help bring about that change is our next presenter, and that's Dr. Gaddis. And listen closely. This man has a lot of great knowledge. So Dr. Gaddis, take it away.
Well, thank you, Sherman. That's way too big an introduction for me. I will say this, that I have been sitting here listening to Dr. Komen and Kay Page and you two. I am glad we're having this panel because my mind is just going in like 50 directions based on what you guys have said. It has been outstanding. And I hope what I'm going to share now in some ways can begin to tie all of this together. And later, maybe we can return to this very conversation about white people and racism a little bit. But what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is, in a way, return to Dr. Coleman's historical analysis. And I want to frame what's happening right now in a more recent history, because I have to say, I am filled with an expectancy and a hope. I am not hopeless right now based on what's going on. And so I want to kind of contextualize that from a historical perspective. So let's start with someone that Kay mentioned just a minute ago. August 28th, 1955. Emmett Till is murdered in Money, Mississippi. He's killed by the husband of Carol Bryant. He makes a statement to her. She claims that he sexually harassed her. And as happens with many African-American men in this case, historically, is that one word turns into rape. It turns into something that it's not. Roy Bryant and his half-brother go to the home of Mose Wright, Emmett's great uncle. He's down in Money, Mississippi, visiting from Chicago. They ask for the boy. Mose Wright has several other children all in the house. You know how it was when we were kids. You know, everybody's in the great room with their palettes, you know, having fun. They knock on the door. They want to talk to Emmett. We want to see the boy. Mose Wright knows these are Klansmen. He doesn't have a choice. What could he do? Have everyone killed? He turns over Emmett Till. His body is found 3 days later, beaten, mutilated, shot, tied to a cotton gin fan at the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. His mother has an open casket funeral in Chicago. The cover of Jet magazine at the time, the most significant Black publication, I think even more so at that moment than Ebony, has the picture of Emmett Till on the cover from the casket. That's in September. 2 months later, an all-white jury finds Roy Bryant and his half-brother not guilty of murder, even after Mose Wright, at the risk of his own life, points them out and says that they were the last ones to see Emmett Till alive. Now, this moment is part of a moment of a confluence of events that launch what we know of as the Civil Rights Movement. Brown v. Board is the year before, 1954. You have Black soldiers who had fought for freedom and democracy in Europe in World War II, had come home and are being segregated against, and Jim Crow and lynched and all manner of the manifestations of structural racism. December of 1955, 2 months after the not guilty verdict in the Emmett Till murder case, which, by the way, over 10,000 people came to that funeral, is the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. So this confluence of moments comes together and begins to launch what we call the Civil Rights Movement. Now, that I want to box that with another bookend. So the beginning begins with the violence of the judicial system, right? That murderers are found not guilty. And I want to box that with another young man, 21 years old, Fred Hampton, 1969. The Chicago police and the FBI break into his apartment and murder him and Mark Clark. Fred Hampton had been a clarion voice, not just for civil rights, but for human rights. He was gathering together what we today call white nationalists, but they were poor white people who saw that they had things in common with poor Black people, and a system that was keeping them both economically repressed. Fred Hampton was standing here in Chicago, and the world was beginning to hear that there is a collective systematic problem and we can do something about it as young people. And then that cold December night, December 4th, 1969, the Chicago police, the FBI had sent an informant, an infiltrator into the Black Panther organization. We know the story. Fred Hampton was drugged so that he with a sleeping agent so he wouldn't wake up. The Chicago police break into his home and they murder him. His official cause of death is a shotgun blast point blank to the head. This is really the end the civil rights movement in many ways, right? King was killed in 68, Malcolm in 65. We have all kinds of other shootings and other things of what's going on in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's death. And something begins to set into the American culture. And it is exacerbated within the African American culture, within our cities. And that's the beginning of what I've called in recent years the nihilistic threat. When you take away resources, when you have education based on zip code, when you have food deserts, when you have all of these health concerns that Dr. Komen is discussing, you begin a period of intensely creating a system of nihilism, a system of hopelessness, of aloneness. And then you pump crack in, and then you pump heroin first, then the crack. Then you over police. Then you have the rise of these independent underground nations. And you have, because of the systematic structural creation of the ghetto, you turn it into a blighted place with poverty levels well above even some third world nations. The highlight of that moment of nihilism, in my opinion, was the beating of Rodney King in 1992. So let's bookend two more sections of time. One bookend is 1992, when Rodney King is beaten by officially 4, but if you look at the video, it's probably like 6 or 7 Los Angeles police officers. The trial isn't even held in Los Angeles, it's out in Simi Valley. I believe 11 of the jurists were white. And those police officers were found not guilty when on tape they brutally beat Rodney King. And then Florence and Normandy went up. That was an expression, and you can get Cornel West's Race Matters on this. It was an expression of this nihilistic threat. This moment of deep pain and frustration and hopelessness that explodes when these police officers are found not guilty of beating a man, and it's caught on tape. There's no question of what happened. And that threat has been growing since then. And all we need to do is look at Dr. Coleman's numbers, look at the way environmental racism works in this country, where asthma and all of these other things are going on in the inner city communities. Look at how they dropped that, did that demolition in Little Village just a couple of weeks ago of blowing up a smokestack completely improperly, but it's in a poor, in this case, Latino dominated community. No big deal. That hopelessness, the exasperation of that hopelessness has been with us. And there was a confluence around Rodney King. You have Rodney King, you got OJ, and we are not getting into that. OJ, all of these things at the one bookend. And then comes Breonna and Ahmed, and in 8 minutes and 49 seconds of George Floyd with a police officer kneeling on his neck until he is dead. A confluence here. COVID-19, which has ripped the scab off of the country's, hope that Barack Obama was the president. We've dealt with our racism issue. No, COVID-19 has ripped that off. The election of Donald Trump has ripped that off. The expressions of unemployment, health disparities, employment disparities, all of that has been ripped away by COVID-19. And then we see once again in this whole period from Eric Garner to Michael Brown of the police, literally choking us to death, taking their knee and putting it on our neck. This moment is a moment where when you look at the protests, the global nature of the protests, the rich variety of those who are doing the protesting, the awareness about recognizing racism by those allies that are out there protesting, the call for reimagining how we do public safety, for finally reimagining the structures that have created the nihilistic threat, the school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration. I mean, we can go on and on. What George Floyd's death can mean, and I think will mean, is that this is the moment that we end the nihilistic threat and begin a new period of hope and structural change on the road to true equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gaddis. And yes, we can't hear you, Dr. Adrian, but yes, you're right. A good round of applause. That was excellent. And I want to move into the questions. Boy, this is something how we're at 10:50 already with our time. But I think I'm going to lead it off with some questions that come to mind, and that is, we've been hearing a call to defund the police in response to the continued incidents of violence against African Americans in the US. Could each of you speak to what that slogan means? And because, when people hear it, you got people saying, oh my God, we're not gonna have any police. But I think when you really look at it and if you study it, there's a number of things what people are suggesting out there. And if each of you could address that. Okay, you want to take a crack at it first?
In my eyes, defund the police doesn't mean literally defund the police. It means changing the structure of the police, making police more responsive to the community in which they work and live. It's calling for, if you have the funding for an armored truck, then you should have the funding for body cameras. It's the idea that when police enter a community, no matter which community, they treat all people the same. It's the concept in the idea of police being a part of the community and not oppressors who enter the community. It's just reimagining how policing is done. It is not, in my eyes, the idea of take away all their funding. Police serve a valuable place in the community if they value the constituents in which they serve.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Komen, your thoughts? And there you go.
The police are here to protect and serve. That's what they say. The reality is they haven't been doing that, right? On a system level, that has not occurred. So when we talk about defunding the police, I think it's actually going back and actually practicing your original mission, which was to protect and serve the people within your community, right? I think it also means not literally getting rid of the finances, that fund the police, but reimagining where the finances should go. maybe building community relationships, having programs for young people in your community so that they see the police as allies instead of their enemy. So defunding the police doesn't mean getting rid of the police. It means restructuring the police and going back to the original purpose of the police, which was to protect and serve. And right now, that just has not occurred. So that's what I see as defunding the police.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gaddis.
Let me just quickly say Dr. Komen is exactly right, but historically the issue of protect and serve begs the question, protect who in service of what? And that's gets to the root of the change that we need. I find it interesting that we over police Black bodies and yet we can't stop crime in Black neighborhoods. That's a whole other subject I'm not even going to touch right now. Defunding the police means reimagining the whole question of what do we mean by public safety. And there are many ways we can look at this. We've got body cams as part of it, civilian review boards as part of it, structuring how unions, and I love unions, but when police unions can take a bad cop and through arbitration put him back on the job, or he can go to another police force and get hired when he's been fired from another police force for excessive force or racism or sexism, or what have you, that's got to change. But let me just really quickly just give you one idea. Just throw this out here. Imagine that there is a car going down the street, there's a couple in the car, the door opens, they're having a fight. The critical incidents team is called, which APD has a critical incidents team. But those are police officers. Yes, they've had some de-escalation training. What if a social worker was in that car with those police officers? What if that social worker was able to begin a process of de-escalation, of talking about this couple and their issues so that they don't get arrested, and then follows up with them to start counseling? What if, because a large number of APD calls are mental health calls, what if that critical incident team goes to Johnny's house because Johnny's off his meds and he's acting crazy, and so a MCP, Masters in Counseling Psychology, goes on that call with them. They take him to Mercy Hospital. Here's what happens. Right now, they take that guy to Mercy Hospital. He stays at Mercy for 3 days. They pump him full of drugs, street him. That's it. What if there was a counselor attached to the police who could follow up, who could look into Johnny's living situation and create and start working on the system at the most local level in his home so that he doesn't repeat, so that this doesn't happen again? What if we had more shelters, more workers to help with our homeless population and so on? So defund the police doesn't mean abolish the police. Defund the police means reallocate the sources away from militarizing and weaponizing the police into creating structures that can help the community. Like the police say it all the time, and I'll be done with this. Police say it all the time. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a homeless shelter coordinator. Fine, let's get some and embed them in the police.
What about should police be required to live in the communities they serve?
Absolutely.
Dr. Komen, what do you think?
I would agree with that. That would give them the opportunity to actually get to know the community, get to know the young people in the community. So I think it's a great idea. And I think the police need to be the ones who are implementing some of the programs and initiatives in the community So yes, for this to work, I think they need to be part of the community. And I think that we need to also make sure that the community is included in policing, right? Police and community members should communicate on a regular basis. The police need to understand the needs of the community, right? And the community needs to feel comfortable enough and free enough to go and share their concerns and their needs with the police. So having them be part of the community and living in the community could help bridge some of those gaps that exist right now.
So again, live in the communities they serve. Live, like, let's take, for example, live right on Route in New York Street, nice condo area there. Live right there. Is that what you're saying?
So
okay. Any of you guys, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, if you have teachers living in the district, if you have police officers living in the city, you are creating exactly what Dr. Coleman's talking about. I mean, look, the police, we have created a structural situation where the police have an overall an attitude that they are not part of the community, but they are actually against the community, right? This warrior mentality, this us against them. Well, what breaks that down more than knowing that, oh, Officer Jones lives right down the street from me? You know, we need to, it creates community, right? We need the police to look at, and everyone, if we're talking community, to see each other as human beings, unique, unrepeatable, deserving of dignity and respect. And that doesn't happen when the number one thing you do with the police is buy them more body armor, more Humvees, more assault rifles. That doesn't send a message that we're with the community. It sends a message that we're against the community.
Okay, what do you think? Live in the communities you serve. Live right there at New York and Broadway.
I'm less definitive on requiring them to live in the community in which they serve. What I am definitive about is they need to be required to do a certain number of community service hours within the community in which they serve, whether in uniform or out of uniform. If you know there's a community center doing tutoring, then let's send some officers in there. Create that relationship with your community. That to me is more key than their physical address. But the relationships have to be created. And I think if we start making the requirement of you need to interact with the people on New York Street, not just in your role as a police officer, but in your role as a human being, I think that changes things and that will change the interactions.
Okay. The interesting aspect, when you look at that, is that it leads us into one aspect that Dr. Gaddis touched on it a bit, and that is, we have the twin threats of police brutality and police under protection in communities of color. It has a long history, and it's coming to a head again. You talk about 1919 in Chicago, 1965 in Selma, 1992 in LA, 2014 Ferguson, and many more. Okay, is the same cycle of protests, analysis, recommendations, and inaction repeating itself? Is this moment different? And if it is, how so? Because I remember growing up, and I grew up on the south side of Chicago in Woodlawn. And I remember in '68, and things were going on, they did the Kerner Commission. And they came out with the book, and it said, America is moving into two societies, one white and one black. Great, bit of knowledge in that commission and all that report that they did. But you seem like you did, as I heard one person said the other day, okay, here we go with lip service again. We're gonna go through this, and then it's going to go back to the way it is. Is this moment different, and how so? Who wants to tackle it first?
Well, I'll just say this very briefly. I'm hopeful that this moment is different. And one of the ways that we can be hopeful is that, let's just talk about Aurora. We had some protests here. Those protests have continued. And there has been hopefully the beginning of some conversations between the mayor and those who are making demands on the city for change, and hopefully that will happen. And the mayor has announced some things and so on and so forth. Whether it's here, Minneapolis, there has been movement to make some change. Whether that's from a House bill that was introduced down to the local municipal level. The real question, I think, here is, can we sustain the pressure to make systematic change? Because the inertia of institutions makes it really difficult to push them into a new direction. So what the worst thing that could happen is that we stop talking about it, we stop protesting, we stop getting in the streets, we stop organizing, and then yes, we just then we go right back to where we were. But I think this is a moment that we're not going to do that and continue to keep the pressure on.
Wow.
Okay. I agree. This feels different. You know, I was just looking at the New York Times bestsellers list, and the top couple of books are White Fragility by Dr. D'Angelo. And then I think number 2 is How to Be Anti-Racist. Change can't come from one group alone. It's people working together. And it feels like people are more interested in working together, in having these coalitions, in continuing the conversation beyond a few days of outrage. Systematic change seems to be on people's minds and in their agendas. And I think that is going to make a big difference in this country.
Dr. Komen?
So, you know, I work with young people, and I've been thinking about my generation, and I'm Generation X compared to the current generation of young people. And my generation, I think that we tried to work within the system. And when we couldn't work within the system, we tried our best to circumvent the system. What I see with the young people today is they're not dealing with the system. They're not working with the system. They're not going to circumvent the system. They're going to completely dismantle the system and rebuild it. And that's where my hope lies. It lies with the young people. So do I think change is coming? Yes. Do I think we're a long way from it? Definitely. It's going to be slow, as you know, change always is. But I think with this new generation, this younger generation of leaders, they're going to make some systemic changes because they're just not accepting the status quo.
Well, you know, one of the aspects in terms of this whole thing, the protest itself, you know, I mentioned earlier with regards to, you know, the problems white people, okay, I want to stay on that from the standpoint of we've got to get whites to talk and to be involved. How many of you remember there used to be a group called Study Circles, and it was all designed. It was through what was her name? That ran the study.
Mary Jane Hollis.
Mary Jane Hollis, right?
And her assistant, Miss Kathy Gaddis.
There you go.
Just
okay, that's right.
That
yeah, you better. She'll remind you of it. But the study circles, which was in the late mid to late 90s, or in the 90s, was where people sat down and they discussed race. And it started out with a handful of people from at that time, the YWCA, of which she was was employed. And they started and they sat and they talked and they really dealt with the issue of race. And it went on for a good couple of years, 2 or 3 years. But then it started to, well, then white started to just drift out. And then all of a sudden it became more just not people of color. And people of color are like, wait a minute, we're talking among ourselves. We know this. Where are the people who were here initially? And I think we need to work to bring that back, to bring it back. And we've got to say to our white brothers and sisters, you've got to come. Yeah, it's going to be very uncomfortable, but you got to sit down. You've got to come. It's like therapy. You got to talk and you've got to be involved and not peter out as soon as you think. I never forget, I worked for a national public relations firm in Chicago. And one night, me and a couple other guys were working late. And one of my white colleagues said to me, Sherman, can I ask you a question? He said, you're the only African Black person on the account. Don't you feel uncomfortable? And I said, man, I've been dealing with this all my life, my work life. And just I did do what I have to do. And then he said, if it was me, I'd quit. I couldn't take it. I couldn't take being the only one. And you get that among white folks where you got to say, wait a minute, somebody else deals with it all the time. And the moment you're going to deal with it, you want to shrek and says, I'm out of here. We got to get them. They have to be part of the discussion. They have to stick with it. They have to talk to their friends and their loved ones to help change all of this. So when you look at it, from that standpoint, I think the study circles, and I'm quite sure, we can work with the library and there's a number of other people like Bill Ketching of the township.
Can I just break in for 1 second?
Go ahead.
Denise Crosby wrote an amazing piece on Wednesday, I think, in the Beacon, saying exactly, Sherman, what you just said about study circles. And so the former assistant and coordinator, Miss Kathy Gaddis, called Bill Ketching, the township supervisor, who is completely on board with restarting study circles. And Krista, we need you and the library to help us with it. But I'm telling you right now, the website will be up this week. Study circles is coming back to Aurora.
Way to go. When this was what did I say? COVID didn't happen to us. It happened for us.
Right.
To move us in this direction. That's fantastic. That is strictly fantastic. And one other question that is coming in from the audience, and that is, the person said, as an ally, are there any organizations in the Western suburbs that I can support that focus on women of color or the LGBT community? Organizations. I know Kauai County Urban League is one. What are some other ones? NAACP, others. But others.
Aurora Demand Forum. You can find that on Facebook. Would be one. Indivisible Aurora, Indivisible DuPage would be two other ones off the top of my head.
Okay, all right. Any others you guys can think of, Dr. Komen, Kay?
Well, the City of Aurora African American Heritage Advisory Board is always a resource to the community.
Okay, all right. And one other quick question I have, then I'm gonna go mainly to questions from the people who are listening in. What impact does the global response to the killing of George Floyd have on the current struggle for social justice in this country? It's amazing when you watch and you see people, how they react around the world. Because, when you think about that, you like I said earlier, that's you can't be a human being and not react to that. What do you guys think?
There were protests in over 60 countries, and recently the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution condemning the killing of George Floyd. I think it's powerful. America, or the United States, likes to be a leader. They like to be the best of the best. And I think the eyes of the world showing flaws, showing the lack of humanity for another person's life is a challenge that is put before our federal leaders to say, we got to do something different. If we want to be leaders of the world, we need to do something different.
Dr. Holman?
So when this happened with George Floyd, some of my colleagues from Ghana reached out to me and let me know we stand in solidarity with you. But in terms of the global world, I shared with you that, yeah, this is an issue in America, but it's an issue around the world. And I think, or what I hope will happen, is that we will begin to look at the marginalization of Black people from a global perspective, right? Not just here in America. We have to look at this through that global lens. And I hope that it will bring unity, right, to our communities. I hope that it will bring equity so that Black people around the world will have the access that they need to housing, to education, to quality healthcare. So I hope this global presence will say we have marginalized people around the world, and we need to look at these issues and address them on a systemic level and make sure that we bring equity forth on a global level.
Okay, all right. Okay. And no, you already covered. You did your response. I do have this aspect of looting. You know, the looting, you know, has been widely condemned. You know, but some, you know, offer justifications. You know, what do you say to people who argue that the social contract has been broken? You know, or that America was built on rioting and looting, like the Boston Tea Party. Is looting as much as America as apple pie?
Can I take that?
Yes.
The answer, you know, and here in our moment right now, and this goes to this whole issue so that we're discussing. And I want to say this very clearly, very concisely for everybody who's listening, and as we carry these dialogues forward, this issue is nuanced as well, right? For example, yes, there was looting in Minneapolis. Yes, there was some destruction here in Aurora and in other places. And yes, in many of those localities, the people who were doing the destruction, who were arrested, were not from those areas. They came into the area and did it. Now, here's the second part of this, and this is where it gets nuanced. Where was all the consternation about the looting and destruction of property when the destruction and property was Tulsa, Oklahoma, 99 years ago? Where was the concern for property and lives in Philadelphia in, what was that, 85, right? When we dropped a bomb on a neighborhood. So, you know, I'm a little distressed that people have been more concerned about property than they have been outraged about what the genesis of the whole thing is, which is police brutality and the lack of concern for Black life. Lives are more important than property, and so yes, looting is part of American history. You can go to the draft riots in New York of 1863, and I'm not going to bore you with that whole thing. Get Sean Willens, read it by tomorrow. You're great. I'm not going to bore you with all that, but in almost all of these mass social protests, there has been moments of looting or destruction of one sort or another. The reality is that people use that as a way to deflect from the core issue, and we can't let that happen.
I agree with you, Dr. Gaddis. It's easier for people to talk about things than to talk about the fact that a man was killed over the course of 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It's easier to distract and change the conversation to something that people are more comfortable with than to have the hard conversations about systematic racism and the fact that people are being killed purely for the color of their skin.
I completely agree with my panel colleagues. Like, I don't even think we should have a conversation about looting without talking about the violence that's been inflicted upon Black people since our existence here in America.
Well, it's interesting that, we were talking about the study circles. Got a question here from the audience. It says, it takes courage for white people to challenge other white people's racism. Are the people in study circles more likely to be people who are already sensitive to this? Is this a bit like preaching to the choir? Study circles? And when it started, it didn't, there were people from all over the community. I mean, it just wasn't what we like to call our usual suspects. And I think this time it definitely has to be different. Right. Don't you think?
When study circles began, people signed up, were randomly assigned to different groups, and there was a sensitivity to making sure that those groups were racially diverse. Now, there has to be some self-selection because some people, not all 200,000 Aurorans participated, but we need to get, and the questioner is right. It takes courage to call out racism when you're a white person. That's true. But if we want to get somewhere, you have to do it, right? And so what Study Circles does is, with a trained facilitator, give people a chance to tell their story. Now, let me give you two hopeful things about Study Circles. I'll be quiet. The mayor of this city, the first Black mayor of Aurora, was a Study Circles participant. That, I believe, had an impact on who he chose as his police chief, and we can talk about all the issues and problems that go with it, and I know it's complex and nuanced and so on, but the truth is, Aurora, I think, has some very good police leadership that we need to work with. There was a reading group that came out of that is still meeting. 15 years later, they read a book about race every single month, and they get together and talk about it. Now, so it requires people to take the risk, but the reward is to build relationships across racial lines. And then in your context, you become the teacher and disseminate things outward. So it's not a panacea, but yeah, it takes courage to call out racism. Can I know I'm taking the time, and I'm sorry. Can I just do one?
Go ahead.
One quick thing, and then I promise I'm going to be done. But this speaks, you've mentioned this several times about white people talking about racism. So everybody watching, everybody at home, go ahead, go get a little piece of paper. And I don't know if you can see this. Can you see that? There it is. Okay, you make a little cross. One side says white, one side says black. You got that? You see that? Okay. Now here's my question on the white side. What have Blacks as a race? So if Sherman, if you're white and Sherman beat you up when he was in high school, that doesn't count. What have Blacks as a race done to whites that Blacks should mistrust them? Slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, police brutality, discrimination in education, housing. We can go on and on and on and on, right? And you put that down that list. Go ahead, people. Let's go to the other side. What have Blacks as a race done to whites to deserve that? You know what the answer is? Be born. So who really needs to be working to dismantle the system?
Another
I'll leave it there.
fantastic question. Another fantastic question. Yes, another fantastic question. One I want to touch on real quick, though, is we've got November coming up. And how can we make sure that people who want to change our country register and vote?
I'll let Kay handle this one.
I struggle with this question. And the reason I struggle with is how can you turn on your TV on any given day and not say something's got to change or something's got to be different? I don't know how you are aware of day-to-day life and not go to the polls. Our governor has made it easy. Vote by mail. You can, if you get a driver's license, you can register to vote at the exact same time. You can't say things have to be different or I need change or any other grievance you can have against government on all levels, federal, state, local, and not turn out to vote. If you want systematic change, you have to ensure that the people in those elected offices represent you and your interest. If you don't do that, if you don't make your voice heard, if you don't show up, you get what you get. And sometimes that's how we get in the positions we're currently in. And I know I've heard the argument, oh, my vote doesn't mean anything. Or if you happen to be Democrat, I live in Illinois, you know, Democrats don't need our vote. Yes, they do. Or if you want to ensure that you are holding your elected officials accountable, you've got to vote. And I feel the same way about the census. Funding for your local communities and all of the things you care about, all of the programs that you care about, is based off the census. Federal funding coming down to the local level is based on per capita, based on the number of people counting. You can't say, my government doesn't serve me, but your government's going to respond, I don't have the money. You didn't fill out your census. You're part of the reason your government doesn't have the money. So fill out your census, register to vote, vote by mail, because we don't know where COVID's going to be. Vote by mail. And if you're not registered to vote, go online to your local election commission and register to vote. That's the only way we're going to have systematic change in this country on all levels.
Let me ask, though, before I get to the other, the Dr. Komen, Dr. Gaddis, in terms of answering that question. I've heard people say, okay, well, I go and vote, but then look what happened in the last election and how the current president won the Electoral College. So the Electoral College makes the determination. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but he won the electoral vote. So what's the point in voting? You know, they're going to decide what they want anyway. How do you answer that?
The Electoral College has been around, and I'll leave it to Dr. Gaddis for the history, since the founding of our country. But if you don't like the Electoral College, the way that it changes is it changes in Congress. Who makes up Congress? People that you elect to vote. And right after the election in 2016, there was, do we abolish the Electoral College? It was a phase that came in and came out. If you want to see a change, put people in office on the federal level who can change the Electoral College. And as far as that goes, that tells you you need to reach across state lines. Hillary Clinton won the country by, I believe, 3 million votes. She lost the state of Wisconsin, I want to say by less than 20,000 votes. So reach across. Do you have family in Wisconsin? Can you send postcards to that state and say, hey, we need you to turn out to vote. You are a swing state. How your Electoral College votes go can change the course of how this election goes, that's key. Not voting is never an excuse. Even if you don't like the outcome, not voting is never an acceptable response.
Dr. Komen, Dr. Gaddis.
So I'll add, well, I'll start off like this. When COVID first hit, and it was a group of young people who had that huge party that was on the media, like, how dare them? How could they? Right? Well, when you talk to those young people, what you found out was that they didn't know the seriousness of these issues. They hadn't been watching the news. They don't tune in to the news every day and hear, well, we have this many deaths from, COVID-19 today. So they had no idea of the seriousness of the issue, right? And so I think the same with voting. They don't necessarily see the value. They don't know how important it is. They don't see this as really being their voice. So I think we have to go to the grassroots level here and work with our young people so they understand the value of voting, so they understand the system of voting, right? So they understand even the people who are running, right? There's so many people who actually, they go and vote and they say, okay, well, I'm just gonna vote Democratic. We don't know if that's the best person for that particular role. We don't know. So I think you have to provide a level of education to our young people so that they will go out and vote, but be informed in doing so. And that
Dr.
doesn't
Komen,
exist.
I want to ask you a follow-up. How do we touch those young people? Is it in the classroom? Is this something that is from home? Is this community service organizations? If we want to touch the young people to make them informed voters, what's the best way to reach them?
So I think first we have to ask them. My students tell me, they say, Dr. Komen, don't send us emails because we don't look at our email, right? So if I want to communicate with my students, I have to do so in a different way if I want them to be responsive. And what we don't do enough of is ask young people what their thoughts are, what they need, how they communicate. And I know they use Instagram. I know that not Twitter as much. They think Facebook is for elderly. So we have to, right, figure out and ask them, well, how do you communicate? And then we have to utilize young people to actually share that message and pass that message along. But we have to meet them where they're at and understand that just because we use one method of communicating doesn't mean that's the method that they use.
Okay, Dr.
And
Gaddis.
that's a good thing, so.
And Dr. Gaddis, I'm gonna just, before you speak, we've gone a little bit over our time. So I'm gonna have you be the last with regards to this, and we'll wrap it up. But this has been fantastic. But go ahead, Dr. Gaddis.
In Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and North Carolina, Donald Trump won by almost the exact number of votes that were not cast because of voter suppression. End of story.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank all of you, and I want to definitely thank the Aurora Public Library for taking this effort and putting this out. The library has always been close to my heart and my involvement with it, and I'm so glad that they have taken it upon themselves to at least launch this, and I'm quite sure there'll be other conversations that are going to be needed. And I hope everyone will continue to get involved with the library. I want to also encourage everyone to make sure that you vote, that you do your census. It's very important, but also to be involved, to talk to young people, to talk to people, period. But understand that going forward, it's imperative among all of us to make sure that we are part of the solution and not part of the problem. So Krista, is there anything last words you want to say before we wrap this up?
This has just been amazing. I want to say thank you so much to all the panelists and to you, Sherman, for moderating. And this was really, I'm very grateful. And thank you to the audience. I want to just remind people about, the census and voting, and check out that story time coming up on Saturday, social justice story time for the littles, if you've got any little ones that might like it. Otherwise, again, thank you so much.
Oh, one last thing. What will people be able to do with regards to study circles? Can they go to the website, the Aurora Public Library website? What's going to be the next steps?
I will definitely check it out. I will, there will be information forthcoming.
Fantastic. Well,
yeah,
again,
also, this will be available on our YouTube. A recording of this will be available on our YouTube. So for those who couldn't make it today, they'll be able to see it on their own time.
all right, so you all heard that. It's going to be available. The recording of this webinar will be on YouTube as well as on Facebook. And again, thank you, Dr. Adrian Komen, Dr. Vincent Gaddis, and Kay Page for this wonderful, marvelous conversation. Everyone, have a great day and continue to remain safe. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.